Usually, when we look at a map of the world, there's this really comforting expectation of permanence.
Right, like everything is set in stone.
Exactly. We see those solid black borders, the neat little color-coded countries, and we just assume a kind of, a geological stability.
Yeah, we assume the people who live within those lines have just always been there.
Right. Perfectly matched to the soil beneath their feet. It looks clean. It feels categorized. But then you step into the historical and cultural landscape of Eastern Europe, and that neat color-coded map just completely dissolves.
It really does. It falls apart almost instantly.
The solid black lines start shifting, they blur, and they overlap in real time. And, for those of you joining us on this deep dive today, our source material just takes an absolute sledgehammer to the idea that this region can be understood as, like, a collection of distinct ethnic boxes.
Yeah, the sources are remarkably forceful on that exact point. I mean, the author of these notes explicitly throws out what they call the tourist brochure nonsense.
I love that phrase, tourist brochure nonsense.
It's so accurate, right? They're totally rejecting this enduring Western stereotype of Eastern Europe as just, well, as a single homogenous tribe wearing one gloomy overcoat.
Yeah, the gloomy overcoat stereotype is so persistent. But so the mission of this deep dive today and the framework these sources propose is that we have to view Eastern Europe as a borderland civilization.
Exactly. It's a historical argument just as much as it is a geographic location.
Right. And right away, the notes highlight the friction between how bureaucrats define the region today and how history actually shaped it. We should probably establish those definitions up front, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because the modern bureaucratic view is very, very narrow.
Super narrow. Like the United Nations uses a strict statistical grouping. It's Belarus, Bulgaria, Czechia, Hungary, Moldova, Poland, Romania, Russia, Slovakia, and Ukraine.
Which, I mean, that serves a purpose for modern legal frameworks, right? And economic distribution.
Sure.
But when we talk about a borderland civilization, that UN list feels, well, it's just entirely inadequate to capture the historical reality.
It really is. So what is the historical definition then?
Well, it's inadequate because the historical definition isn't drawn by modern treaties. It was carved by deep time and ecology.
Okay, so the actual physical landscape.
Exactly. The broad historical definition describes Eastern Europe as this vast, incredibly fluid transitional zone. So think of it as the massive space situated between the German-speaking and Mediterranean cores of Western Europe on one side,
Right.
and the sweeping Eurasian steppe to the east.
It's just a massive chunk of land.
Huge. It stretches down from the Baltic Sea, it cuts through the Carpathian Mountains, fills the Danubian Basin, reaches the Black Sea, and pushes deep into the Balkans and Western Russia.
Wow. Okay, so if we're dealing with a transitional space of that magnitude,
Yeah.
we really have to start with the physical ground itself.
You have to. You can't understand the people without understanding the dirt.
Right. And the source material makes it clear that the geography here didn't just casually influence human development. It dictated societal structures with this, like, brutal predictability.
Brutal is the right word.
We're looking at an ecology defined by massive extremes. You have the North European plain. You have these imposing mountain systems, the Carpathians, the Balkans, the Dinaric Alps.
Right. Huge natural barriers.
And then these massive river corridors, like the Danube and the Dnieper, and they're cutting right through some of the most fertile black earth soils on the planet. Okay, let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah, the black earth belts, the Chernozem, they are totally crucial to understanding the underlying mechanics of the region.
Because of agriculture.
Right, exactly. These soils made parts of Ukraine and southern Russia into one of Eurasia's greatest potential grain belts. And naturally, that favored incredibly dense, sedentary farming populations.
People are going to settle where the food grows best.
Right. But then, right alongside them, you have those upland forests and mountain ranges you mentioned. Those functioned as natural, defensible redoubts.
It's like fortresses.
Basically, yeah. They became refuge communities, places sustaining mixed farming and herding, somewhere people could retreat to when the plains became just too dangerous.
And the plains invariably became dangerous. I mean, when I look at the topography of the North European plain, the analogy that comes to my mind is a massive, incredibly wealthy city that just, well, they forgot to build outer walls.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
And then, not only did they forget the walls, they decided to run a high-speed, multi-lane superhighway straight through the center of downtown.
Yes. A completely exposed superhighway.
Right. So it's an absolute masterpiece for commerce and logistics. You've got amber, furs, wax, grain, slaves, all moving fluidly between the Baltic and the Black Sea. but it's an utter nightmare for home security.
It really is. That exact same geographic corridor lays out a red carpet for invading armies.
Because there's nothing stopping them.
Nothing. There are no oceans to provide a protective moat like you have in Western Europe. There are no impassable continent-spanning mountain ranges sealing off those eastern borders.
So it's just wide open.
Completely wide open. And because of this extreme exposure, the region became what the sources term a hinge zone.
A hinge zone. Okay, I like that.
Yeah, it's this concept of being thoroughly connected to global wealth networks, which is great, yet perpetually exposed to sudden, devastating upheaval, which is obviously terrible.
Right, a permanent state of anxiety,
Which is
basically.
like, and this physical reality created a permanent grinding tension between two completely incompatible ways of life.
The nomads and the farmers.
Right.
Yeah.
On the open plains, you had the mobile steppe confederations. These were nomadic aristocratic societies, and their entire power structure was tied to horses, martial prestige, and, well, the control of movement.
And that completely challenges how we think about power today.
Oh, fundamentally.
Because they didn't view power as owning a specific demarcated patch of dirt, right? We think of power as, this is my land, here's the fence.
Right, the modern nation-state model.
But for them, power was the ability to extract wealth from the movement across the land. Like if you can control the horizon, you control the wealth.
That's exactly it. Whereas the sedentary agrarian polities, the farmers, they were entirely tethered to the land.
They can't just pack up their wheat fields and move.
No, they rely on agricultural surplus, tribute, fortified centers, and eventually religious institutions to maintain order.
So you have this collision course.
Always.
Yeah.
And because the transport routes were almost exclusively river-based before the modern era, the agrarian power structures couldn't simply draw a line on a map and claim everything inside it.
Right, because the empty space between the rivers was too hard to control.
Exactly. So political authority clustered tightly around geographic choke points.
Like river crossings and stuff.
Yeah, river crossings, deep water ports, the narrow valleys, basically anywhere where goods physically had to stop and pay a toll.
Okay, so if we accept that this landscape was essentially an open highway and power was only really concentrated at specific choke points, the logical downstream effect is that the human population living here must be an unbelievable mix.
Oh, a massive mix.
Because anyone who could ride a horse fast enough or sail a boat down a river could enter the region. Which brings us to a really fascinating point in the notes regarding human origins, tracking a timeline of migration that goes way back into deep prehistory.
Yeah, the demographic layering here is just profound. The sources map out a long, complex sequence of arrivals.
So where did we start?
We start with Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, right? They were perfectly adapted to the dense forests and the river systems. Then, arriving largely from the southeast, we see the early Anatolian Neolithic farmers bringing agriculture and permanent settlement.
Okay, so farmers moving up from the south.
Right. But the really decisive pivot happens during the Bronze Age, with a massive influx of steppe pastoralists.
These are the horse riders.
Exactly. Ancient DNA studies highlight the Yamnaya-related populations, these highly mobile groups expanding from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. And their genetic and cultural impact became a foundational component across the whole continent.
And then later you have the Slavic expansion too, right?
Yes, the decisive 6th century Slavic expansion, which swept across massive parts of the region.
Okay, wait, so let me stop you there, because this timeline completely dismantles the national myths that we often hear in modern political rhetoric.
Oh, completely.
There is this enduring romanticized narrative, and you hear it everywhere, that present-day peoples sprang fully formed from their specific national soil.
That they grew out of the ground.
Right, that they are the pure, unmixed descendants of some ancient homogeneous tribe. Are you saying that kind of biological purity is essentially impossible in a hinge zone?
It is entirely impossible.
Yeah.
The sources explicitly define identity in Eastern Europe as a layered outcome. It is the result of thousands of years of migration, language shift, biological admixture, and, constantly shifting political consolidation.
So no one was living in a bubble?
No, these populations didn't exist in sealed, sterile containers. They constantly mixed, they fractured, and then they reassembled under different ruling coalitions over very long periods of time.
The notes actually offer the Bulgarians as a perfect case study for this layered outcome, and I think it really illustrates how fluid identity was.
It's one of the best examples.
Because we think of Bulgarians today as a Slavic, Orthodox Christian nation. That's the modern box they fit into. but their foundational origins are completely composite.
Very composite. The first Bulgarian Empire was established by the Bulgars.
And who were they?
They were a Turkic-speaking ruling elite that arrived from the Eurasian steppe.
Wait, Turkic, so they weren't even Slavic originally.
Not the ruling elite, no. They were steppe nomads. And the mechanics of how that empire evolved are really fascinating. The Turkic Bulgars arrived and established rule over a vastly larger population of local sedentary Slavs.
Okay, so you have a small Turkic elite ruling a massive Slavic peasantry.
Right, but rather than forcing the Slavic peasantry to adopt Turkic customs and language, which is what we might typically expect from a conquering force, the ruling elite eventually assimilated into the demographic majority.
Oh, wow. They just absorbed the culture of the people they conquered.
Exactly. They became linguistically Slavic. And then, later on, to secure their geopolitical standing, they adopted Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire.
So they completely rebranded.
They did. So when you ask the question, who are the Bulgarians? Answering it requires acknowledging a synthesis. It's steppe martial organization, Slavic language and demographics, and Byzantine religious institutions.
That is wild. It really requires us to completely abandon the modern concept of the ethnic nation when we're looking at the past.
You have to. It doesn't apply.
Like if a peasant living in the Balkans in the year 1400 was asked to identify themselves, they wouldn't give you a modern nationality, right? The concept wouldn't even compute.
It wouldn't, because the hierarchy of identity evolved through very specific stages.
How did that work?
Well, in the earliest periods, identity was deeply local. You were bound to your clan, your extended family, or maybe just a specific river valley.
I'm from the river.
Basically, yeah. But as major empires and organized religions moved into the region, identity scaled up to the confessional community.
Meaning your religion.
Right. You were defined by your faith. Later, you were defined by your legal estate, like whether you were a noble, a burgher, or a serf, and by which emperor you paid your taxes to.
Ah, okay. So it's faith, class, and ruler.
Exactly. The rigid concept of the modern ethnic nation, where language, blood, and state borders are all supposed to align perfectly, that only really hardened into its current form between the 18th and 20th centuries.
That is so late in the game. So if early identity was driven primarily by faith and the umbrella of imperial rule, we really need to examine the era when these massive, incredibly diverse populations actually lived together under one roof, right?
We do, and the sources use a specific time frame for this, roughly 1450 to 1800.
Okay, so early modern period.
Yeah, they use this as the master lens for understanding Eastern Europe as a borderland civilization. This is the era of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the advancing Ottoman frontier, the vast Habsburg network, and, the rising power of Muscovy.
And here is where it gets really interesting for me, because this is arguably the most crucial period for understanding the region's cultural DNA.
Oh, absolutely.
Take the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. At its height, it was one of the largest and most populous states in Europe, but its demographic makeup was dizzying.
Dizzying is a good word for it.
Right. It wasn't just ethnic Poles and Lithuanians. The Commonwealth encompassed Ruthenians, which are the ancestors of modern Ukrainians and Belarusians, as well as immense populations of Germans, Jews, Tatars, and Armenians.
It was incredibly diverse.
And from a religious standpoint, it held Roman Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Muslims, all coexisting within a single federated state. We have to unpack the mechanics of how a state like that actually functioned.
It's hard to wrap your head around, honestly.
Yeah, because applying a single set of laws to a population that diverse seems logistically impossible for a pre-modern government.
Well, you're right. It would have been impossible if they tried to enforce a single, modern, centralized legal code.
So what do?
Instead, they relied on a system of layered sovereignty.
Layered sovereignty. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Power in the Commonwealth, and really in many of these borderland empires, was fundamentally overlapping and decentralized. Different communities lived under entirely different legal frameworks within the exact same geographic space.
Wait, really? So if you were, say, a German merchant, a Polish nobleman, and a Jewish artisan, and you're all living on the exact same city block, you answered to completely different authorities.
Precisely.
Wow.
Yeah, a German merchant might be governed by Magdeburg rights, which dictated the urban economic laws.
Okay.
But the Polish nobleman next door, the Szlachta, he had immense privileges. He was essentially operating as a mini-sovereign entity on his own estates, completely immune to the king's direct interference.
Almost like his own king.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the Jewish communities possessed institutions of self-administration. They managed their own taxation, education, and civil disputes through their own councils and religious courts.
That's incredibly complex.
It was. It wasn't egalitarian, obviously, and it certainly wasn't a modern democracy, but it was a highly pragmatic, modular way of managing a complex, multi-ethnic mosaic.
Right. You just sort of let people govern themselves within their own lane.
Exactly.
But a major part of managing that mosaic came down to religion. And the notes emphasize that religion in this context cannot be understood merely as, like, personal spiritual belief.
No, it functioned as geopolitics.
Geopolitics.
Yeah.
The sources refer to religion as a declaration of civilizational alignment.
Which is such a vital concept here. In a borderland where state authority is decentralized, your religious affiliation basically determined which broader global network you were plugged into.
Okay, let's break that down.
Sure. If you were Catholic, your cultural, intellectual, and political compass pointed toward the Western Latin sphere of Europe.
So the papacy, Italy, France, the Habsburgs.
Exactly. If you were Orthodox, your alignment was toward the Byzantine sphere, and increasingly toward Moscow, as it started positioning itself as the Third Rome. And if you were Muslim, your primary civilizational anchor was the Ottoman sphere down in Istanbul.
So it's almost like putting on a geopolitical team jersey.
That is a brilliant analogy. Yes, a team jersey. It immediately signaled to everyone which broader world you aligned with.
But that kind of alignment becomes incredibly high stakes when the borders between those spheres are constantly moving.
High stakes doesn't even begin to cover it.
The source material maps out scenarios where a single village might be governed by an orthodox authority, then the geopolitical fault line shifts, and suddenly they find themselves under Catholic rule.
Overnight sometimes.
Right. And then centuries later, they might fall into the aggressive state atheism of the Soviet era, only to reemerge as orthodox again in the modern day.
Exactly.
It is the exact same population living on the exact same plot of land, but their institutional reality is completely overhauled every few generations.
And when a population is forced to endure that kind of structural instability, it fundamentally rewires their sociological baseline.
I mean, how could it not?
Right. You cannot have your legal codes, your elite classes, and your state religion overturned 3 times in a century without it leaving a profound psychological mark.
The notes actually offer a really fascinating psychological framework to analyze this exact phenomenon. They refer to a regional mindset modeled as the Devon persona.
Ah, yes, the Devon lens.
Yeah, it's described as a subpersonality lens moving from an isolated fortress to a redeemed warrior. And it's shaped by cold, guilt, precision, and an overriding drive to transform historical damage into a severe form of integrity.
It's a very intense profile.
Super intense. So how does a framework like that manifest in the actual day-to-day sociology of the region?
Well, the Devon framework is a brilliant way to conceptualize the institutionalization of trauma. To understand how it works, we really have to contrast Eastern Europe with Western Europe.
Okay, let's do that.
In the West, societies often had geographic escape valves.
Like the oceans.
Exactly. Oceans that provided a buffer against invasion, and eventually overseas colonies that allowed them to vent demographic and economic pressure outward.
So if things got too tight, you just left on a boat.
Right. But Eastern Europe was a pressure gradient with no escape valve. The threats came horizontally across the open plains again and again and again.
So the pressure has nowhere to go but inward.
Exactly, just builds internally. When a society is subjected to unrelenting inward pressure, when distant empires repeatedly conquer you, extract your wealth, and then collapse or retreat, people learn a very harsh, practical lesson.
Which is?
Trusting large, abstract institutions is a fatal mistake.
Wow.
Structural power is viewed as inherently temporary and usually hostile.
So if the state is seen as a temporary occupying force, even when it's technically your own nominal government, where does a society place its trust?
Trust retracts. It pulls back from the state and embeds itself into private, deeply guarded networks.
Like your family and friends.
Exactly. You trust your family, your immediate village, your church, and perhaps a very tight circle of associates. Communal identity overrides the kind of abstract individualism you see in the West.
So it's not just people wanting to be traditional for the sake of it.
No, not at all. It isn't driven by a quaint desire for traditionalism. It is a hard-nosed survival strategy. Think about it. If the central government isn't going to feed you when the famine hits or protect you when the army marches through, your neighbor is literally the only safety net you have.
That makes total sense. And this perfectly explains that trait of transforming damage into integrity
Yeah.
that the Devon persona outlines.
Right, because what else do you have?
Exactly. In a culture where conquerors can just confiscate your land, rewrite your laws, and execute your leaders on a whim, the only asset you truly control is your internal resilience.
Dignity becomes a form of moral property.
Oh, I like that phrase, moral property.
The culture develops a profound, almost sacred prestige around endurance, martyrdom, and defiance. Trauma isn't treated as a single, unfortunate historical anomaly that you just, recover from and leave in the past.
Right, it's not something you get over.
No, it is integrated into the cultural operating code. The
Yeah.
society honors the figure who bends under the weight of an empire but refuses to break completely. That's the redeemed warrior aspect of the Devon lens.
It is a stoicism born out of absolute necessity. But, as the sources point out, it is an incredibly expensive way to live in terms of human suffering.
The cost is staggering.
Yeah. Yet, out of that exact same intense crucible, we see the emergence of incredibly rich, complex, and layered cultural outputs.
It's the beauty born from the pressure.
Right. The daily life, the food, the music of this borderland civilization reflect the exact same forces of overlapping sovereignty and shifting boundaries. The notes actually highlight something as simple as borscht to illustrate this.
Ah, borscht, the great debate.
Yes, because there are these intense, almost comedic, decades-long disputes over the national ownership of this beet soup. Why does a beet soup trigger such fierce national pride?
Well, disputes over borscht are a perfect microcosm of borderland anxiety.
Okay, how so?
When you live in a region where cultural ownership is inherently messy, where a dish has been shared across multiple Slavic, Jewish, and Baltic cuisines, evolving through centuries of shifting borders, claiming absolute national ownership of that dish becomes a proxy
A proxy for what?
for asserting historical legitimacy.
Because if your borders have been erased from the map multiple times, claiming that your ancestors invented a foundational cultural artifact is a way of proving you have a permanent right to exist.
Exactly.
It is a culinary assertion of sovereignty.
Precisely. True Eastern European culture is inextricably composite. The architecture in cities like Lviv or Sarajevo is a physical sedimentation of Byzantine, Gothic, Ottoman, Habsburg, and Soviet styles.
It's all just layered on top of each other.
Yes, and the languages borrow vocabulary extensively from their conquerors and their neighbors. So when a modern ethnostate tries to draw a hard line around a cultural artifact like borscht, they are attempting to retroactively enforce a clean, national narrative onto a reality that was fluid and layered.
Which is basically impossible.
Completely impossible.
But this fluid reality has also been heavily distorted by outsiders looking in, which is another huge theme in the notes.
Yes, the Western gaze.
Right. The source material spends some time analyzing how Western pop culture has consistently flattened the complexity of the East. And the primary example they dissect here is Bram Stoker's Dracula.
What's fascinating here is how the West just completely missed the point of the history.
Right, because Dracula took a brutal, highly complex geopolitical reality and reduced it to a Gothic horror trope.
Exactly. The historical inspiration, Vlad III of Wallachia, was a 15th century ruler operating in one of the most violent, contested fault lines in global history.
The frontier between the Ottomans and Christian Europe.
Yes. His use of impalement and extreme brutality was not born of supernatural evil. It was a calculated strategy of psychological warfare and deterrence.
Because he was a minor power facing a vastly numerically superior Ottoman military.
Exactly.
He was utilizing terror as an asymmetrical defense mechanism on a porous border.
Yes. But when Bram Stoker, writing in Victorian London, pulled that history into his novel, he stripped away all the geopolitical nuance.
He took away the layered sovereignty.
All of it. He took the survival mechanics of the borderland, and he repackaged the trauma of the eastern frontier into a haunting, supernatural menace just for Western consumption.
The West ignored the complex civilizational struggle and kept only the vampire.
Exactly. It's the ultimate manifestation of the tourist brochure nonsense the sources warn against.
It really is. But, while the West was busy fictionalizing the East was genuinely exporting cultural frameworks that altered the globe.
Very true.
The notes specifically trace the trajectory of klezmer music as a prime example of this synthesis.
Klezmer is a brilliant artifact of the mixing chamber. It originated within the Ashkenazi Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, and it drew its foundational elements from synagogue chants and religious liturgy.
But it didn't stay purely religious.
No, because these communities were deeply embedded in the borderland, the music naturally absorbed the secular sounds around it.
Like what?
Slavic folk rhythms, Roma instrumentation, and even distant echoes of Ottoman military bands. It is a purely synthesized art form.
And as the immense Jewish diaspora was forced to flee the region due to persecution, they carried that cultural synthesis with them, giving it this incredible global reach.
And it influenced so much more than just music.
Right. The notes even detail how the descendants of that Eastern European Jewish diaspora, particularly through the Borscht Belt resorts in the mid-20th century, fundamentally laid the architecture for modern American stand-up comedy.
It's amazing when you trace that lineage.
The rhythm, the self-deprecation, the cadence of managing anxiety through humor, that is a direct downstream effect of a culture forged in a high-pressure borderland.
It is. The cultural vibrancy of the multi-ethnic mosaic was undeniable. For centuries, despite the friction and the shifting empires, you had this complex, relatively functional coexistence in these layered urban centers.
It was a beautiful mosaic.
It was. But the historical narrative presented in the sources requires us to confront the catastrophic rupture that annihilated that world.
Yeah, we have to look at what happened to make the modern map look so different.
The 20th century essentially dismantled the borderland civilization, and it did so with unprecedented violence.
The sources trace a very clear, grim trajectory of how this multi-ethnic mosaic was shattered. And the unraveling really begins with World War I.
Yes, World War I fundamentally destroyed the old imperial architecture.
Right, the massive dynastic empires that had provided the umbrella for that layered sovereignty we talked about. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, they all collapsed in rapid succession.
And the collapse of those empires created a massive power vacuum. But the true fatal blow to the demographic reality of Eastern Europe came with World War II and the Holocaust.
It's just devastating.
It is. The Holocaust was not merely a tragic event occurring within the region. It was the systematic annihilation of one of its core civilizational pillars. By the end of 1945, approximately 2/3 of the European Jewish population had been murdered.
Which is just a staggering, incomprehensible loss.
The vibrant, multilingual, urban Jewish world that had been integral to the intellectual, economic, and cultural life of the borderlands for centuries, it was just eradicated.
And the destruction of that world was accompanied by a massive, aggressive redrawing of the map.
Yes, the post-war borders.
The notes describe a period of forced demographic engineering, massive ethnic cleansing, the brutal expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans from the East, the forced relocation of Poles and Ukrainians.
It was horrifying.
It was a violent attempt to force the messy, overlapping reality of the borderland to fit into the rigid boxes of the modern ethno-state.
And this is the critical transition the sources highlight regarding identity.
Okay, what's the shift?
For centuries, the primary political question a person had to answer was, who rules me?
Right, which emperor gets my taxes?
Exactly. But in the late 19th and mid-20th centuries, as the Western European concept of nationalism swept through the region, the vital question became, who am I?
Wow. The idea that every ethnic group defined by language and blood must possess its own pure sovereign territory.
Yes. And when you take the exclusive, rigid logic of the modern ethno-state and you apply it to a deeply mixed, overlapping demographic mosaic, the mathematical result is always tragedy.
Because the people are too mixed.
Right. You cannot carve clean, homogeneous borders into a land where 3 different ethnic groups have shared the same river valley for 500 years without relying on mass violence and expulsion.
Following that trauma, the region was immediately submerged into the Soviet era.
The Iron Curtain falls.
Exactly. And the source material describes this period as the imposition of an artificial ideological unity.
Artificial is the key word there.
The Soviet apparatus didn't resolve the deep historical ethnic frictions, it merely suppressed them. It replaced the complex questions of ethnic and religious identity with a rigid, state-enforced class ideology.
The Soviet system functioned as a massive, brutal lid placed on the pressure cooker.
Just clamping it down.
Yes. It froze the borderland dynamics in place through authoritarian control and the constant threat of overwhelming state violence. But the underlying tectonic plates of history, the religious alignments, the territorial disputes, the cultural suspicions, they never went away.
They were just hiding.
They were perfectly preserved beneath the ice of the Cold War.
Which explains exactly why, when that lid was finally removed after the collapse of communism in 1989, the region didn't simply transition peacefully into a Western-style, end-of-history, liberal utopia.
Far from it.
The old tensions immediately resurfaced, and the region began to fracture and reorient itself once again.
The collapse of the Soviet Union allowed the deep historical mechanics of the hinge zone to resume operation. The populations were once again forced to navigate an open, exposed geopolitical landscape, balancing their internal cohesion against the pull of massive external power centers.
So what does this all mean for today? And to be clear to our listeners, I'm presenting this exactly as the sources map it out, completely impartially, just to understand their view of current geopolitics. The source material maps out the modern post-1989 realities by showing how these ancient tensions are currently manifesting in three major ways.
Right.
First, there's the undeniable geopolitical pull, the desire of many nations to integrate into the European Union and NATO.
Seeking economic prosperity and a protective security umbrella.
Exactly, which collides directly with the stark, violent reality of Russian security imperatives, culminating in the warfare we see in Ukraine.
That's the external pressure.
Right. Second, the sources highlight a profound internal struggle, the demographic crisis. You have rapidly aging populations and a massive brain drain of young people emigrating to the West.
Which creates intense political anxieties regarding the physical survival of these cultures.
Yes, demographic survival versus cultural openness. And finally, there's the ongoing cultural friction between the deeply ingrained traditional norms of the region, like the authority of the church, primacy of the family unit, and the influx of liberal modernity from the West.
And the really crucial takeaway here is that these modern dynamics are not new phenomena.
They're just the old ghosts.
Exactly. They are the exact same forces of the borderland asserting themselves in a 21st century context. The historical pattern of the region is an oscillation between two specific modes.
HR.
First, a quiet, enduring stoicism where societies keep their heads down to survive under immense pressure. And second, periods of explosive, defiant assertion where national identity hardens and demands recognition.
So the geopolitical and cultural clashes dominating the headlines today are simply the latest iteration of this ancient balancing act.
Yes, weighing unity against fragmentation and tradition against the relentless tide of outside influence.
It's all connected. Pulling all of these threads together, the ultimate insight from these notes is that Eastern Europe is far more than just a set of coordinates on a map.
It really is.
It serves as the world's most intense, enduring laboratory for how human beings adapt to living directly on a civilizational fault line. It proves definitively that identity is not something quietly handed down in a biological vacuum. It is something forged, fractured, and violently remade under immense pressure.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, I think the historical reality of the hinge zone demonstrates that humans are fundamentally memory-bearing creatures.
Memory-bearing creatures. I love that.
The populations of this region have absorbed unfathomable catastrophe. They've watched their empires fall. They've rebuilt their societies from the rubble time and time again. And yet, they continuously carry their ancient ghosts into their new institutions.
The ghosts are always there.
Always. It is a profound testament to the depths of human resilience, while simultaneously offering a stark historical warning about what happens when unresolved trauma is allowed to harden into permanent political structures.
It is a profound lesson. And as we conclude, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your day.
Please do.
We have spent this entire deep dive exploring how the physical geography of Eastern Europe, the wide open plains, and the total lack of natural defensive borders forced its people to forge ironclad, deeply suspicious identities just to survive the constant influx of external forces.
The open highway.
Exactly. But as we move deeper into a hyper-globalized digital age, physical geography is losing its monopoly on our lives. National borders mean less and less every day.
That's true.
So we have to wonder, will these fiercely protected, pressure-forged local identities slowly dissolve into a generic, globalized culture? Or is the internet simply becoming the new wide-open plain?
Oh, wow.
A vast digital borderland with absolutely no walls, where these ancient human patterns of invasion, defense, institutional suspicion, and the urgent need for private trust networks are just going to replicate themselves all over again in the virtual world?
That is a fascinating question.
Something to think about the next time you log on or the next time you look at a map and realize those solid lines are just an illusion. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.